Throughout history, humanity has devised ways to end human life that go far beyond simple killing. These methods were designed not just to execute, but to inflict maximum suffering, to serve as brutal warnings, and to satisfy the darkest impulses of those in power. What you're about to hear are accounts of execution methods so horrific that they challenge our understanding of human cruelty. These aren't just stories of death. They're stories of prolonged agony, of victims who endured unimaginable torment before finally succumbing to their fate. The methods I'm about to describe were real. They were used on real people, often for crimes as minor as theft or speaking against a ruler. Some victims were completely innocent, caught up in political schemes or religious persecution. Others faced these brutal ends simply because they were born into the wrong family or lived in the wrong place at the wrong time. But regardless of their crimes or circumstances, what happened to them represents some of the most savage chapters in human history. You might wonder why anyone would create such elaborate methods of killing when a simple sword or noose would suffice. The answer lies in the psychology of power and control. These executions weren't just about ending a life. They were public spectacles designed to terrorize entire populations into submission. They were demonstrations of absolute authority, ways for rulers to show that defying them would result in consequences worse than death itself. The executioners who carried out these methods were often skilled craftsmen in their own right, trained in the precise techniques needed to maximize suffering while keeping victims alive for as long as possible. Some took pride in their work, viewing themselves as artists of agony. Others were simply following orders, carrying out the will of kings, emperors, and religious leaders who demanded increasingly creative forms of punishment. What makes these execution methods particularly disturbing is how methodically they were designed. Every aspect was calculated to cause maximum pain, from the positioning of the victim to the speed at which the torture progressed. Nothing was left to chance. The goal was to make death as slow and agonizing as possible, sometimes stretching the process over hours or even days. The first method on our list takes us to ancient Persia, where rulers developed a technique known as Scaphism, or the boats. This execution method was reserved for the most serious crimes, and it represents one of the most psychologically twisted forms of capital punishment ever devised. The process began with the victim being stripped naked and placed between two boats or hollowed-out tree trunks. Only their head, hands, and feet remained exposed. The boats were then sealed together, creating a makeshift prison that would become the victim's tomb. But death wouldn't come quickly. The executioners force-fed the prisoner milk and honey until they developed severe diarrhea. This mixture was also poured over their exposed face and limbs, attracting every insect in the area. Flies, wasps, and other creatures would swarm the helpless victim, landing on their face and crawling into every opening. The real horror began as days passed. Trapped in their own waste, unable to move or defend themselves, victims slowly succumbed to a combination of dehydration, starvation, and infection. The insects would lay eggs in their flesh, and maggots would begin consuming them while they were still alive. Death could take anywhere from 8 to 17 days, during which time the victim remained conscious for much of their ordeal. Historical accounts indicate Scaphism was used sparingly, reserved for traitors and those who committed crimes against the royalty. The method was so notorious that some enemies of Persia would commit suicide rather than risk capture and the possibility of facing the boats. Even hardened soldiers who had witnessed battlefield deaths spoke of Scaphism with particular dread. Moving from ancient Persia to medieval Europe, we encounter another method that pushed the boundaries of human cruelty. The breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel, became one of the most feared forms of execution across the continent. Unlike Scaphism, which relied on nature to slowly kill its victims, the breaking wheel required active participation from executioners who would spend hours methodically destroying the human body. The victim would be tied to a large wooden wheel, their limbs stretched and secured at specific points. The executioner then used an iron bar or hammer to systematically break every major bone in the victim's body. The process followed a precise pattern, starting with the limbs and working inward. Each bone was broken multiple times, creating dozens of fractures that caused excruciating pain but didn't immediately kill. The skill of the executioner determined how long the victim would survive. A skilled executioner could keep someone alive for hours, breaking bones in a sequence that avoided vital organs. The victim remained conscious through most of the ordeal, feeling every crack, every shattered bone, every wave of agony that swept through their broken body. Oh, that's interesting. Crowds would gather to witness these executions, treating them as public entertainment. Vendors sold food and drink to spectators who cheered or jeered, depending on their relationship with the condemned. Children were brought to watch, supposedly to learn about the consequences of crime. The atmosphere was often carnival-like, with people placing bets on how long the victim would survive. The psychological impact on the condemned was devastating. They endured hours of anticipation, each blow drawing closer, each fracture a new terror. Some begged for mercy that never came. Others cursed their executioners or cried out religious prayers. A few refused to scream, clinging to dignity in the face of unimaginable suffering. After the bones were broken, the wheel would be raised on a pole and displayed in a public square. The victim, still alive but unable to move, was left exposed to the elements. Birds would begin pecking at their flesh while onlookers continued to gather. Death usually came from shock, internal bleeding, or exposure, but it could take days. The breaking wheel wasn't just about punishment. It was about sending a message that echoed through entire communities. Parents would point to the broken bodies and warn their children about the consequences of defying authority. The image of a person twisted into impossible angles, bones jutting through skin, became seared into the collective memory of anyone who witnessed it. Records show that executioners took pride in their technique. They studied anatomy to understand exactly how to break bones without severing major arteries. Some developed signature methods, becoming known regionally for their particular approach to maximizing suffering. These men weren't monsters by the standards of their time. They were skilled professionals carrying out legal sentences handed down by judges and approved by religious authorities. Our next method takes us to ancient Rome, where cruelty reached new heights of sophistication. The Romans perfected crucifixion, but they also developed lesser-known techniques that were arguably more brutal. One such method involved trained animals in elaborate death spectacles that could last hours. Victims would be covered in animal hides and thrown into arenas with starving predators. But this wasn't a quick mauling. The animals were specifically chosen and prepared to prolong the experience. Lions might be partially fed beforehand so they would toy with their prey rather than kill immediately. Bears would be provoked but not enraged to the point of swift killing. The goal was entertainment value, keeping the victim alive and screaming for as long as possible. The crowd's reaction was integral. Spectators cheered for particularly creative kills or booed if death came too quickly. Trainers worked with animals for months, conditioning them to respond to crowd noise and pause their attacks at specific moments. Some victims were partially rescued only to face the animals again, creating false hope that made the eventual death even more psychologically devastating. Women and children weren't spared from these horrors. Entire families were thrown to animals as punishment for political crimes. The youngest victims often died first, unable to run or fight back. while parents were forced to watch before their own fate. The psychological torture of watching loved ones ripped apart added layers of agony that went beyond physical pain. Moving forward in time, we encounter the medieval practice of being drawn and quartered, an execution method combining public humiliation and methodical dismemberment. The condemned would first be dragged through the streets behind a horse, their body scraping against stones and debris. By the time they reached the execution site, they were already severely injured, bleeding, and often barely conscious. The actual quartering involved tying each limb to a different horse. The horses would then be driven in opposite directions, slowly pulling the victim apart. The process was deliberately gradual, allowing crowds to watch as joints separated and muscles tore. Executioners sometimes made shallow cuts at the joints to ensure limbs detached, but avoided severing too deeply so death would come slowly. The victim's awareness during this process was perhaps the most horrifying aspect. Pain receptors fired continuously as their body was torn apart, but death wouldn't come until major organs failed or massive blood loss occurred. Some victims remained conscious even after losing limbs, their torso still breathing as executioners prepared the final stage. The head was traditionally saved for last, kept alive to witness the destruction of their body. This wasn't accident, but design. The goal was to maximize psychological trauma. Imagine knowing your head will soon join the display. These weren't random acts of violence, but carefully orchestrated events that required extensive planning. Officials coordinated multiple executioners, animal handlers, crowd control, and logistics. The timing had to be perfect to ensure maximum impact on both victim and viewers. Every detail was calculated to create lasting terror that would prevent future crimes. The locations chosen for these executions were equally important. Public squares, crossroads, and marketplaces ensured maximum visibility. Bodies or body parts remained on display for weeks afterward, serving as constant reminders of what awaited those who challenged authority. What makes these historical accounts so disturbing isn't just the physical suffering involved, but the systematic nature of the cruelty. These weren't crimes of passion or moments of temporary insanity. They were institutionalized forms of torture that entire societies not only tolerated, but actively celebrated. These methods of execution represent more than just historical curiosities or tales of bygone brutality. They reveal fundamental truths about human nature and the corrupting influence of absolute power. Every technique we've explored was created by ordinary people, sanctioned by legal systems, and witnessed by communities who viewed suffering as entertainment. The victims of these executions weren't monsters or irredeemable criminals. They were human beings who felt fear, pain, and desperation in their final moments. Their stories remind us that the capacity for both cruelty and compassion exists within every society, and that the difference between civilization and barbarism is often thinner than we'd like to believe. Perhaps most unsettling is how these practices were normalized in their time. People brought their children to watch, vendors sold refreshments to spectators, and communities celebrated these events as necessary demonstrations of justice. It forces the question, what practices in our own era will future generations view with similar horror and disbelief? These weren't just executions. They were systematic attempts to destroy not only life, but human dignity itself. Understanding this dark history doesn't glorify it. It serves as a stark reminder of where unchecked power and dehumanization can lead. The echoes of these methods still resonate today, warning us to remain vigilant against the forces that would reduce human beings to objects of suffering and spectacle. If you found this exploration of history's darkest chapters compelling, subscribe for more content that examines the uncomfortable truths about our past and present.